Thank you for coming. Please turn to 1 Corinthians chapter 14, please, as we continue our studies in the book of 1 Corinthians. The section that we're dealing with is discussing the problems that the church had in their assemblies, disorder and confusion and so on. And in particular, chapters 12 to 14 are talking about the problems with regard to spiritual gifts. Chapter 12 talked about comparing the church to a body with many members, and the members are all important, should care for one another, and the same is true in the Lord's church, that we should care for one another, and the application to the Corinthians that they were not caring for one another, but were seeking to compete with its spiritual gifts and so on. In chapter 13, showed the gifts were temporary and would cease, so the importance of loving one another. Chapter we're in now is going to discuss discussion about how they should conduct themselves in their assemblies, especially regarding spiritual gifts. But that's where we're starting, is chapter 14 this evening. Let's see. Okay, chapter 13 compared love to the spiritual gifts, that love never fails, is going to endure and abide, but spiritual gifts would vanish away, so the Corinthians should emphasize love rather than being so concerned about what spiritual gifts they had or didn't have. And in particular, he talked about how that spiritual gifts were in part. That is, at this point, they delivered only part of the revelation of God's will. But when that which was perfect or mature had come, the full revelation was complete, the spiritual gifts would be done away. And he compared that to a child who acts like and talks like a child. When he grows up, he puts away the childish things, and the same thing is true with regard to the revelation. At the time Paul wrote, it was partial, it was immature, that was only partly delivered. But when it was complete, then the spiritual gifts would no longer be needed. And then in the last part of chapter 13, he talked about faith, hope, and love would abide in comparison to the spiritual gifts that would cease. So that's where we were at the end of our study last time. Questions or comments anybody has before we begin chapter 14? All right, let's go ahead and read the first part of chapter 14 now. I encourage you, in fact, to read through this chapter each week as we're studying it, to get the whole context, because it goes together. It helps us get an overview, I think. But let's just read the first 9 verses tonight. 1 Corinthians 14, verses 1 through 9. Who'd like to read that for us, please? 1 Corinthians 14, verses 1 through 9, please.
Pursue love and desire spiritual gifts, but especially that you may prophesy. For he who speaks in a tongue does not speak to men, but to God. For no one understands him. However, if the Spirit, he speaks his mysteries. In the Spirit he speaks his mysteries. But he who prophesies speaks edification and exhortation and comfort to men. And he who speaks in a tongue edifies himself, but he who prophesies edifies the church. I wish you all spoke with tongues, but even more that you prophesied. For he who prophesies is greater than he who speaks with tongues, unless indeed he interprets, that the church may receive edification. But now, brethren, if I come to you speaking in tongues, who shall I profit to you unless I speak to you either by revelation or by knowledge, by prophesying or by teaching? Even these things without life, whether flute or harp, when they make a sound, unless they make a distinction in the sounds, how will it be known what is piped or played? For if the trumpet makes an uncertain sound, who will prepare for battle? So likewise, you, unless you utter by the tongue words easy to understand, how will it be known what is spoken? For you will be speaking into the air.
Okay. So to begin with, question number 1, I ask you to summarize the chapter. So as you look at 1 Corinthians 14, what do you see as the theme, or how would you summarize what the chapter is about? Rick?
I've got down edification and order in the church.
Edification and order in the church. Okay. Other ways of summarizing the chapter? Anybody? Frank?
Correcting disorder in the church concerning the use of miracles and specifically speaking in foreign languages.
Okay. So whereas Rick pointed out the importance of order in the church, Frank is pointing out that Paul's correcting problems and the lack of order in the church in Corinth. Okay, well, let's get that. Okay. Oh, okay. So let me just summarize briefly some things, material we've already recently covered, to discuss the problems that were there and Paul's efforts to correct those problems, just summarizing the overview of what there is, I believe, in the chapter, in the overall context. He's teaching them to love one another and care for one another, which they were not doing. They were not showing regard for one another. So he's teaching them the importance of love, as we saw especially in chapter 13. He's teaching them the importance of understanding and edification, that when they are as they're assembled together, the things they should do should be edifying, things that people can understand. Whereas, we're going to see, the way they were using the spiritual gifts, the tongues in particular, people did not understand what was being said, and therefore they were not being edified, they were not being encouraged and strengthened in their service to God. He's encouraged them to have unity and order. Again, there was disorder, there was division. In particular, he's encouraging them to act together. What I mean by that is, as they do each activity, they should do it together. We talked about it in the Lord's Supper in chapter 11, but in chapter 14, we're going to see the same thing is true in all the activities that we do. Each one should be done together, not just some people doing one thing and other people doing something else at the same time. But we focus on the same activity together, and in particular, that the women are in submission to the men. Those are the areas that I believe he emphasizes, correcting the problems in Corinth as he does. Okay? Comments, discussion before we move on? Okay? And then one more point, again, we talked about more than once, is that even though it's discussing spiritual gifts in this chapter, there are general principles here that we need to apply to our situation today. What Paul is doing, I believe, is taking various spiritual principles which have general application. He's applying them to their particular situation, but they have other application as well. And so we should not just set aside the principles because of the application of spiritual gifts, and we don't have spiritual gifts. We can't say, well, we won't apply that. Everybody really, at times, applies things in these chapters, 12 through 14, even though they're talking about spiritual gifts, because we know that principles do apply. So let's keep that in mind as we go, that we're trying to apply principles that are taught to our situation, even though we don't have spiritual gifts today. Anything else before we get into the specifics of the chapter 14? Okay. All right. So we're looking at tongues and prophecy in the first section in Corinth. So I ask you question number 2. Was Paul telling them that they could not use tongues? They had problems with the use of tongues. Was he telling them to just quit, don't use the tongues? Rick?
I'm not telling them they can't use tongues, but if they do use tongues, make sure everybody understands it.
Okay. But if the spiritual gifts are going to cease, why would people want the gifts then? Why would they matter if they're going to cease? Frank?
So that the church would be edified and grow and understand the wisdom of God, his plan of salvation.
Okay. We need to understand, remember, while we're saying some things that are very critical about how the Corinthians were using the gifts, that doesn't mean the gifts were unimportant, or even though they're going to cease, that doesn't change the fact they had a very important role. We should not belittle the existence of the gifts and what they did. The Holy Spirit gave these gifts for reasons. Specifically, we're going to see, to teach the people. They didn't have the written word. They didn't. That which is perfect had not yet come. So they couldn't go to their Bibles and say, okay, here's what we need to do about this, here's what we need to do about that. They needed revelation. That revelation came in various forms, as we've seen in the spiritual gifts, including, in particular, prophecy and tongues. The tongues at times were useful, but the problem is the Corinthians were misusing them. He's not against the use of tongues, or certainly not prophecy, or any of the spiritual gifts. They were all very important because they gave us the written word. And they confirmed that it is the word of God. Don't ever in any discussion with anyone come across as though we think the gifts were not important. They were essential to our knowledge. But they have since then completed their purpose and ceased. Paul is telling them how to use them while the gifts continue to exist. Okay. Other comments on verse 1? Rick?
Do we have any apostles left today?
Okay, your point is?
Apostles was needed then with the powers that the apostles had. We don't have them around today. We have God's scriptures.
Okay. And so we can make the same point with the apostles as we do with the prophets and the tongue speaking and so on. They're not here. But there is a sense in which we have apostles today. We have their work. We have what they did permanently saved, preserved for us. Do we have Jesus on earth today? No. Did that mean his work wasn't important? Obviously, what he did was essential. But we don't need him on earth anymore because he finished his work. Same thing for the writing of the scriptures, the revelation. We don't need living apostles and prophets and men with spiritual gifts today because they completed their work. We have the results of it in the scriptures. Okay? Anything else on? Excuse me. I have a fly bothering me. Anything else on the question number 2? Okay. Now, ask you question number 3. To discuss and to understand again what the tongues were. And I think it's important because people who claim to have tongues today consistently misuse 1 Corinthians 14. So let's go back to the passage that in our study, at least in our minds, the passage that he defines clearly for us what tongues were, Acts chapter 2, the Pentecost experience. What were the tongues in Acts chapter 2? What are we talking about when we talk about tongue speaking as a miracle, a spiritual gift? Here.
Verse 8 of chapter 2 says that the people are saying, and how is it that we hear each in our own language in which we were born?
Okay. Tongues are language, and the word is still used that way today. It's used that way throughout the scriptures, not just miraculous speaking in tongues, but just languages. It's a language. And we talk about a person's native tongue today. It may be English, it may be German, it may be Spanish or French or whatever. It's a language. In those days, they had different languages as well. And in Acts chapter 2, you had 15 different nationalities gathered for the day of Pentecost in Jerusalem. And the apostles were enabled by the Holy Spirit to speak in the languages of those people that were there, even though they never studied those languages. The miracle of tongue speaking was not the fact that something different was spoken other than a language. The miracle was that they spoke it without having studied it, without knowing the language by natural means. They were able to speak it. That's the miracle of tongue speaking. And I believe as we look at chapter 14, we're going to see there's no reason to think it's anything different in 1 Corinthians 14. The problem in 1 Corinthians 14 is not that the tongues are different from Acts 2, it's just that they're being used differently. Other comments on what the tongues were? Okay? So if we understand and agree that the tongues in Acts chapter 2 were languages, then why is it in verse 2 of 1 Corinthians 14 that it says, he who speaks in a tongue does not speak to men but to God, for no one understands? Acts chapter 2, people understood. 15 different languages people understood. Why is it, and what's different about Corinth? Why is it here nobody understands? Comments? Rick?
The only thing I can understand is they must be speaking in a language that wasn't spoken in that area.
Okay, that's the answer. The language they spoke was not the language of the people at Corinth. It wasn't the language. It was that the language spoken, nobody there knew it. So there was no instruction to them, no message to them, because they didn't know the language. We might compare it to Acts chapter 2, would be like, say, the United Nations, where you have a whole bunch of different languages there. If somebody could stand up and speak a dozen or more different languages without studying them, that would be a miracle. But for somebody to come into this assembly, right here, right now, this class, and start speaking in Russian and Chinese and Japanese and so on, what good would that do? Nobody would understand. There could be real languages, but they wouldn't edify, we wouldn't benefit because we wouldn't understand. That's the problem at Corinth. So, okay, comments, discussion. There's a reason why I'm emphasizing that. Comments or discussion anybody has? All right, here's the thing. When you talk to people who believe in tongues for today, and you say, well, the tongues have been done away, but the tongues were languages. And you go to Acts chapter 2 and you try to show them that. And they say, well, we don't have the kind of tongues in Acts 2, we have the kind of tongues in 1 Corinthians 14. Which they say, see, nobody understands what it is as a prayer language. It's a special secret prayer language between us and God, but nobody understands it. Just like in 1 Corinthians 14. The thing is, 1 Corinthians 14 is not different from Acts chapter 2. It's just a different circumstance. The people here didn't know the language being spoken. And so that's what was causing the confusion or the problem. And so if people say, well, we're doing what's 1 Corinthians 14, first of all, they're not really doing it because they're not speaking a language. They're speaking gibberish and don't maybe realize it. But in the second place, they're not speaking, they're not doing what 1 Corinthians 14 was, or if to the extent that they are, Paul's saying, quit it. Don't do it because people don't understand. So the response, even if they did what's in 1 Corinthians 14, the response would be, don't do it, quit it, it's not right. Okay? So when we talk about the fact that he says no one understands, he speaks mysteries, he says, we need to understand that what that means is that they were, in essence, misusing the gift that they had. Doesn't mean the gift was wrong, they just weren't using it properly. Okay? I think we'll see that as we carry through, as we go through the rest of the chapter. Other comments or discussion? Rick.
There, the men does not speak to men, but to God. God understands any language we speak. God understands our hearts. We don't even have to speak, and He understands us.
And the point is, He's the only one who understood. Because the people didn't understand. God understood, but nobody else. So what was the point in speaking it to the group? That's his point. Okay? Other comments? All right. Then looking at question number 4, jumping into verses 2 through 5 now, and he's talking about prophecy compared to tongues. And, well, let's just look at verse 3. What do you tell us about prophecy in verse 2? In contrast to what was happening with the tongues, what does prophecy do? Susie.
It edifies, exhorts, and comforts those who hear it and understand it.
Okay. So where the tongues, nobody understood, well, where's the edification if you don't understand? How are you being exhorted? How are you being comforted or helped in any way spiritually with a message you don't understand? But the prophecy was done in the speaker's native language, which in this case would be the same one as the language of the people. And they would understand, and they're now being edified, exhorted, and comforted. Okay? So he, at the very outset, notice the importance of, number 1, understanding, number 2, edification. He's trying to get them to see that what's important here is not how you feel about it, or even how you might think that what you're doing is so important and you're so exalted and maybe even have a better gift than other people. See, that's got nothing to do with it. The question is, are you benefiting others with what you say? Okay? Other comment on verse 3. Frank?
Seems that if they'd understood some of these things and that they cared for one another, that the people who could speak in a different language would be aware or would find out if there was anybody there who could understand that language, or from the country where that language was spoken. For the necessity, was there a necessity for that language?
Well, you would think that they would do it, but that's part of the problem. And we've seen throughout that book of 1 Corinthians that the people are not thinking about other people. They're thinking about themselves and their own goals or exaltation and so on. Okay? Now, Rick.
You go back to the last chapter on love, brotherly love. And through prophecies, you're edified, you're exhorted. And I like the last part of that verse. And you have comfort.
Okay.
Through edification and crying that, and it brings you comfort to your own soul.
And if you love one another, that's what you do for one another. And go back then again, chapter 12, that the different parts of the body are working together, not in division, but in caring for one another. But they didn't do that. That was the problem. That's why he talked about those things, to prepare us for this discussion in chapter 14. But they didn't care for one another. They didn't love one another as they should. Okay? So now the next couple of verses. What about tongues? How does he contrast the tongues to the prophecy in verse 4? What's the contrast in verse 4? Still in question number 4, I guess. Karen?
Well, it says, he who speaks in a tongue edifies himself, but he who prophesies edifies the church.
Okay. So the tongue speaker is just concerned about himself, you see. Not saying that's the way it ought to be, saying that's the way it is here. That's what they were doing. It's not just saying it's always that a tongue speaker just edifies himself. We're going to see, in fact, he's going to tell them how that they can edify other people with their tongues if there's an interpreter. But the way they were doing it, the tongue speaker was the only one who got anything out of it at all, but the one who prophesied, the congregation, the group would benefit from what was being said. Okay? What Paul is doing is answering the question really in their minds of these people, what is greater, tongues or prophecy? And they think tongues are greater because it's impressive. It makes a big splash. So, well, look at this. And the same thing today. The people who want tongues today want to have, in many cases, want to be able to make a show. And a lot of times, if they have it in their assembly, they have a bunch of different people at the same time speaking in what they call tongues. It's not really biblical tongues, but it's noises that they're making. When really they should be thinking about helping one another, which comes through the teaching, which was in this case by prophecy. So he's answering the question of what's really important, and the tongues could be useful if used properly, but prophecy would edify the group because it's always what the people can understand. Other comments on verse 4? Daryl.
I'll have a follow-up, but why do you suppose people would speak in a tongue in this circumstance? To make a show, what do you think might have been their motivation?
Comments? Rick?
To show that they had a gift, that they were special.
Okay. Show off?
Okay, my follow-up then, because I agree with that. The word edify means build up, of course, as you know. I'm not sure about this, but I think Paul may be making a play on words here. He's not using edify exactly the same way in the two parts of this verse. The one who speaks in a tongue, as Rick said, is showing, I have this gift. He's building himself up. And I think that may be what Paul means when he says he edifies himself. He's just building himself up. There's no real mature purpose in this. But if you prophesy, you build up the church.
Okay, that's an interesting point. I've wondered about that. So you're saying he's building himself up, but not in a good way.
Right.
Yeah, interesting. Another misuse.
Yeah.
Okay, interesting point. Okay, other comments to 4? Okay, now verse 5 then. What does he tell them about tongues in verse 5 and prophecy? Is he saying it's wrong to speak in tongues? What does he say about it in verse 5? Susie?
Well, it's not wrong to speak in a tongue if there's an interpreter, because there's no edification otherwise.
Okay. Other comments? Karen?
Well, and he also says that he wished they all spoke in tongues, but even more so that they prophesied because of the edification that the church receives from prophecy.
All right, so he plainly says which is greater. He who prophesies is greater, and he speaks with tongues, unless indeed he interprets, that the church may receive edification. So again, the goal is to benefit the group, not just the speaker, but the group, to help other people. And so the prophet can do that. The tongue speaker can't, unless what he's saying is interpreted. Okay? Comments? Susie?
This is a side point, but I kept thinking, why didn't God just always provide an interpreter? If somebody's in the congregation is going to have tongues, why isn't there an interpreter? Why didn't God do that? But the more I've thought about it, because of love, in order to use these gifts properly, they had to have love for one another. And so they had to grow in their use of the spiritual gifts, just like they had to grow in everything in their spiritual journey.
Anything God gives us can be misused. Whatever gift it is. Any good thing that God gives can be misused. And so the problem that they're having here is that the gifts are good, but they have to use them properly. But they're misusing them. Okay? Other things can be misused too. I don't know what he likes about me. He may be the only one here who likes me. I don't know. Okay. All right. So, all right. Now, one other thing I want to make a point about. If the tongue could be interpreted, what does that tell you about the tongue? If it was capable of being interpreted, Frank?
It's an actual legitimate language.
Sure. It's a language that can be interpreted just like any other language. The problem was there was no interpreter in the congregation. That's clearly the point as you go through it. So there's nothing different about the tongue here from Acts 2. It's the same kind of thing. It's a language. The difference is there was people who understood it in Acts 2. Here there's nobody to interpret, nobody who understands it. And so when you talk to people today who claim to have tongues, and you discuss that point with them, you need to be able to point out, here's the proof, and we'll see it more as we go along, that this is a language, just like in Acts chapter 2. And they often will say, we want the Pentecostal experience. And they even sometimes call themselves Pentecostals. But when you ask them what they do, they don't even, in the end, they'd say, we're doing what's in 1 Corinthians 14. Well, why do you call yourself Pentecostal if you don't do what's in the day of Pentecost? The thing is, it's a language, same as it was in Acts 2. The difference is there's no interpreter to explain it. Okay? Anything else through verse 5? Karen?
Susie asked the question about why not an interpreter every time. I don't know, but possibly Christians needed to realize and learn that the spiritual gift itself was not what was most important. It was the church, edifying the church. And so they needed to understand and realize that if there's no interpreter, then that speaking in tongues is of no value. it's of no use. So it's like other gifts or talents, unless it's used properly and for edification of the church, then we need to understand and realize that.
Okay. Question number 6 then, verse 6. What had to happen then for the speech to benefit the people? We've talked about it several times. What has to happen for the speech to benefit people? Verse 6. Frank?
They either had to interpret it, or an interpreter had to be able to interpret the language, but it had to happen by revelation, by knowledge, by prophecy, or by teaching. And it's all the tongues or the languages are useless if the hearers can't understand. They have to be able to understand it for it to be useful for their edification.
Okay. So it could be revelation, knowledge, prophecy, or teaching, but it has to be something that profits you. See that? How do I... What shall I profit you unless I speak it this way? Again, that's the issue. Are what we're doing, is it profiting people? Is it benefiting? If it's just for me, that's not the point. What I do simply should be for the benefit of the group, for others as well, not just for myself. And that's the goal that's being, that he's encouraging them to do in the use of the prophecy and the tongues. The only way that it would be true with the tongues is if they're interpreted. Okay? Other comments through verse 6. Rick?
Even the prophesying and the prophecy would have to be in their language. It couldn't be in a tongue. It has to be in their language that they understand.
Right. Let me ask you this question. Could prophecy be misused? Of course it could. False prophets. Prophecy could be misused. Any of the gifts could be misused. There's no guarantee anything God gives us that we're going to use it properly. We have to do what God says with it in order for it to be beneficial. Okay? So, Paul has introduced the need to do things properly spiritually with the tongues and the prophecy, and we'll see as he goes along more instruction to show them how to use them properly. Questions or comments before we close? I'll take up at verse 7 the next time then. Thank you.